latest episode of the Moviescramble podcast. Thank you so much for that one person who keeps coming back for more. We're glad that we're keeping you entertained. Tonight, I am joined by just one of my fellow colleagues. It is, of course, our editor-in-chief, John. John, how are you?
Okay, yeah. It's freezing cold. I've been stuck in my wee room every day of the week for what seems like an eternity, but apart from that, yeah, it's all good.
Your family just had enough and it's like, right, into the cupboard, John.
Yeah, I pretty much, yes. Away you go. I don't want to see that jumper anymore. On you go.
It is rather dark and miserable, which is probably quite in keeping with the film that we're going to discuss today, which is quite dark and quite miserable itself. We are talking about All Quiet on the Western Front.
Nächster. Paul Bäumer. Ich möchte noch nicht loslegen.
Sind jetzt an der Westfront.
This, of course, is based on the Eric Maria Remarque's anti-war novel, and this is the third incarnation of this film, which I didn't realise. There was other versions in 1930 and 1979. This is a German language adaptation, and apparently it is the most expensive German language film ever put on Netflix, which is, you can see why. There's obviously a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack here. It is directed by Edward Berger, who has previously directed episodes of the fantastic Deutschland 83, which is a thoroughly brilliant series, and if you haven't seen that, you should definitely check it out. True to the novel, it follows the experiences of Paul Bäumer, played by Felix Kammerer, who I believe is making his debut, as he is sent to the Western Front during the last 2 years of World War I. John, what were your initial thoughts when you first started watching the movie? Because I think the opening is quite atmospheric.
It is, yes. I had never read the book and I've not seen any of the previous incarnations of the film, although it's always one that the 1930 version is the one that is always mentioned in sort of polls of Great War movies. So I didn't really have any preconceptions about what I was going to see, and I was completely blown away by this film. I think, even before we even start talking, I think it's going to be one of my movies of the year. It's right up there. It's a fantastic piece of work right from start to finish, and I was completely absorbed right from the very opening. I obviously didn't know what to expect because I just knew the sort of bare bones of the story, and I hadn't deliberately not watched any trailers or anything because I wanted to go in as fresh as possible. So you're hit with this initial punch, almost as a prelude to the story of Paul. And it never really lets up from there. It's bleak, it's harrowing, but it's also engrossing. It's just a fantastic piece of film. Very, very impressed by it.
I completely agree. And actually watching it in the house made me, as you say, straight from the outset, you're sort of drawn into it. And it did make me think, damn, I wish I'd seen this in a cinema. Because it did feel very, very cinematic. I think when the film opens, obviously, there's this kind of, and it happens throughout the film, but I think it's maybe most notable in the opening moments. It really plays with sort of loud and soft. So you've got this image of a fox sleeping with all of her cubs, and you're just waiting for the breath as the fox moves her body up and down. And then all of a sudden, you've got the soundtrack rattling in, which sounds like an alarm going off. And obviously, like the sort of crack of, machine gun fire or whatever it is. I think this is a film that, I think this is one of the films where I've really noticed the sound design. So I think this loud and soft that happens throughout, how did that sort of impact your viewing of it?
It was quite surprising because with a film like this, I was expecting the soundtrack and the sound design to be very influential on it, but I didn't expect in the way it was because there was like electronics in there to begin with, and it was like very modern in the way that the sort of sound came in. It was deep. It was like a sort of like Hans Zimmer, Inception or Interstellar type soundtrack, and it kind of caught you off guard because, as you say, it starts off very gently, and you're going, "Oh, lovely wee fox!"
Yeah.
And then obviously there's the forest, and everything's quiet in the forest, and that's obviously the taken right from the title, All Quiet. So, and then all kicks off. But it was incredible that the way they were able to like go up and down in those sort of terms.
Yeah.
I know that this kind of sound design is used more in the likes of horror films. In a way, this is.
I would argue this
horror
is a
film.
horror film.
Yeah. And it's used to very good effect, not in a way that horror films traditionally use it for the likes of jump scares, but this was just increasing the tension and increasing the desperation that you were actually seeing on screen at all times. So yeah, it was really, really effective. Very impressive.
And I did jump out of my skin a couple of times. I won't lie. The opening moments where, as you said, you've got this, the breathing fox, and then that kind of 3-horn blast that you hear throughout it. I absolutely leapt out my skin because I wasn't anticipating the soundtrack like this. I think you're right. It uses elements of sort of like kind of techno music and sort of sounds definitely very Hans Zimmery. I kind of was expecting, sort of like, searing strings and all that sort of thing. It really plays around with, I think, what you were expecting, certainly from a sound perspective anyway. And also just in terms of the kind of, I talk about loud and soft, but to me it's like light and dark throughout it as well. I think there's little moments throughout it where you've got things like, his uniform comes to him and he's like, "Oh, you've made a mistake, somebody else's name is on it," and he hands it back. Or there's moments where you get little close-ups of sort of like intimate interactions between people, or you've got moments where someone is sitting just observing like what the fuck is happening, and they've got shadow or they've got debris across their face, and there's this, I feel like it really moves you in waves across the entire film. It's kind of lulls you into something, and then it's like, nope, here comes the next wave, and it's really well executed, I think.
Yeah, it's classic storytelling because you can't take it up to 11 and then keep it on that for like the duration, because then you get desensitized to it, and no matter what's actually on screen, then it doesn't affect you because you're up at that level. So you have to sort of ride a wave where things happen, things don't happen, things happen, and that's very much like warfare itself. From like accounts of warfare, it can be sitting about for 2 weeks, and then there's 2 hours of action, and then it's back to sitting about, not doing anything, just keeping your head down, which is the big part of it, especially when you're in the trenches. You keep your head down at all times. So yes, it worked very well that way. It meant that you were invested in the story and you rode those waves with the characters themselves, because the quieter moments were the sort of character moments, and like I say, the small elements of things that drew you more into the surroundings and drew you more into the people who were actually involved in it. So it definitely worked.
I really loved the quieter moments, especially when there was quite a lot of close-ups which were almost fourth wall breaks, but not quite. And so you got this real reaction shot of, essentially these boys who are nothing more than cannon fodder, essentially. And you're watching them watching what's going on. And I thought those really sort of slow, lingering close-ups, I thought were really, really effective because, the big set pieces, the big fights, obviously, that's the kind of spectacle that you expect from a war film. But I thought those quieter moments were perhaps more, not maybe more revealing, but certainly more devastating when you're watching the boys react to what's going on. One thing that I've noticed, though, is that there is a wee bit of criticism around the scenes with Daniel Brühl. So Daniel Brühl's production company obviously co-produced this movie. He has a small role in it as Matthias Erzberger, who is sort of trying to negotiate peace, essentially, or the end of the war. There's a lot of complaints that, in reviews that I've read, certainly, that the scenes with him sort of pulled you out of the actual action itself. What did you think of that sort of combination of outright warfare and actually here's what's going on behind the scenes?
I can understand the criticism because it kind of stops the action, the frontline action dead. But I felt that was the whole point of it, because it was to show the difference between the conditions they were living in and what they were actually expected to do, and the people who are actually making the rules, what they were doing at the same time, how they were actually involved in it. And it showed basically two different worlds, if you like, because there was a lot of, you would have them in the trenches and they're scrambling about for anything they could eat. And then there was all the delegates at the armistice talks, and they were all sitting down to a nice meal and everything, you know. So it went back and forth that way. So it kind of highlighted the different approaches. They didn't seem to, well, in terms of the French, they didn't seem to be in any sort of rush to get this through. They had the upper hand by this point because Germany was on its knees in terms of the war effort. So they were quite relaxed about it. Obviously, the Germans were more relaxed, but because they were in a situation where they weren't getting shot at, whereas they would cut away and there was these guys, you know, in the trenches been told, you know, up you go, over, you know, we're having another push. So even while this is going on, so no, I can fully understand it, but I kind of got what they were trying to do with it. And for the most part, yeah, I think it did work because you needed that as well, because it was a bit of relief from the relenting misery, if you like.
It's taking a breath, I think. And I think that one of the things those seasons, certainly for me, is I find myself getting really angry because, you know, here is these guys who, you know, several of them admit, they just want the medals, they want the glory, they want to be remembered. And they've got, you know, the shiny boots, the uniforms that fit and that are weather appropriate. They're worried about whether or not their bread is fresh. And I'm like, for fuck's sake, you're literally sending 16-year-olds to get shot and blown apart within seconds of going, you know, up and over. And I think for me, it just, I understand why people are saying it's taking them out of the action, but for me, it just made me angry because by this, you know, you are invested in these characters. And so hearing these, it's always bloody men, isn't it? Hearing these men in a room making decisions that, and the thing is, when did any of them even go near a trench? You know, you look at them and you just think you've got no idea what you're putting these guys through. It's just.
Oh no, I think they knew exactly what they knew exactly what these guys were going through, but that wasn't their concern. They were thinking more of the, well, rightly or wrongly, they were thinking more of the bigger picture and their own legacy. Especially the commander, the sort of local commander of the troops. He was thinking of his legacy and the fact that, well, he comes out at one point and says he was born too late because he was involved in a war where Germany lost rather than like one of the previous ones where they won, you know? It
was, that in itself, and again, but I guess just obviously having no experience of any of that, I can even fathom that mentality of like, why would you want to go to war? Why would you want this as part of your legacy? So it definitely, it just infuriated me, especially when, as you rightly said, you know, they're knee high in mud, they're scrambling about for, you know, food. They're risking their lives to get food as well, because there's a couple of scenes where they obviously try to raid a farm. I mean, it's a war film. I guess we can't talk about it without talking about the battlefield sequences, the sort of fight choreography, the cinematography surrounding all of that. The scene that stood out for me certainly is the scene where we finally get the view from Paul's perspective, and it just takes your head slightly over the top of that trench, and oh fuck, there's 3 massive tanks.
Yeah. They're all in the bunker, and they've basically advanced onto the Belgian lines, isn't it? It's the Belgians they were fighting, or no, sorry, the French, and they get into their trenches and they find food, and they're starting to eat it, and then suddenly it's like a Jurassic Park type moment. Everything starts rumbling and everything, and all the rats disappear. And that's when they go, oh, something going on here. At that very moment, when all the rats are disappearing and they're standing there with the chicken legs, sort of like, you know, but they're not scared because they're all hardened by that point. They know what they're doing and everything. Yes, they obviously inside they'd be scared, but they're hardened soldiers and they know what they're supposed to do. So therefore, they sort of just it's like, you know, it's not something that they don't want to do. It's just because they know they can. And they just got on with it. They don't run away. If you notice that, they don't just.
No, absolutely not. Yeah,
they defend.
Yeah, it's for me. I think I mean, there was obviously sort of kind of action set pieces or whatever, but I think for me, what really struck me is, and we've kind of touched on the fact that this was almost a horror, you know, within about half an hour of the film starting, you know, you've had a bunker collapse to the extent where I actually felt like there was debris in my throat because this, you know, everything's so murky, you can't see, everyone's covered in dust. And then you just have these horrible, it's not necessarily like outright warfare. It's more sort of hand to hand that's more frightening.
Yeah.
You get two soldiers just a few yards apart who, you know, one has a flamethrower or, you know, one's got a bayonet. And I think to me that was what was most shocking, was quite a lot of it was actually, it seemed personal, if that makes sense. That, you know, it was just two guys who found themselves on different sides.
Yeah, it's not the same as the idea of sort of modern warfare, which is done by drones a lot of the time, and it's airstrikes and it's all quite precise. You've still got land battles, but it's not quite the same. There's not the same level there. Yes, it was far more personal because if you think about it, it was two sets of men running at each other while bullets were flying both ways. You were just as likely to get killed by somebody behind you shooting as somebody in front of you. And like you say, when they run out of bullets, it's hand-to-hand combat, it's bayonets, it's rocks, it's drowning people in pools of water and all sorts. And it's quite graphic, and it's not entertaining. And really, I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not a piece of entertainment. It's like a piece of, you know, recreated history. So
it's not a spectacle, I think,
it's not there to titillate you in any way. It's to show you that, you know, this was horrible. And it's like young guys, it's 17 and 18-year-old boys a lot of the times doing this. Because if you think about it, at the start of obviously there's the whole initial setup, which is really before there's the big battle, and you're seeing like the guy running out onto the battlefield and everything, and then spoiler, he gets killed, and he's they go through the whole sequence of, you know, pulling all the uniforms off and the boots and everything, and then recycling them all, like you say,
which in itself really, it's so, again, it feels so, you're literally wearing a dead man's clothes. Like everything about this felt really personal. I guess that's the word I keep coming back to, but I think it's because, you know, when you I watch a lot of war films, but it's usually these big sweeping sort of, you know, overhead shots of, you know, faceless men all running at each other. This felt really intimate, which is so horrific. Yeah,
you're brought into the story with the group of schoolboys, basically, so you're following them, so there's an intimacy there just within their group. And like you say, when they're fighting against the enemy, it's hand to hand, it's face to face, it's not any great distance. You get stuff like that. Obviously, the very first introduction Paul gets is when he's on sentry duty the first night, and he hears a noise, so he shoots, and then somebody shoots him because they see the muzzle flash, and gets the ding in his helmet, and he gets thrown back. You know, he could quite easily have been killed in the first day of conflict because of his inexperience, because he didn't know, and nobody told him, because why bother? If he gets killed, there's going to be somebody else that come up and fill his place. That's just the way of it. There was just a stream of young guys. It's just, it's horrible. It really was. Such a waste.
It really is. And obviously the sort of title cards at the end tell you that they barely moved more than, 100 yards, 200 yards?
Yeah.
Like, they were fighting over a street, basically. Like, it never moved. And yet, you just think of, you know, we've obviously talked about, certainly for me, how this film feels so personal, and yet at the same time, it is just this faceless mass of, you know, young boys up and over, up and over, up and over, and obviously millions of men who just obviously didn't make it back. I think one of the things that really stands out is, as you've touched on, you know, the scene where he kills the French soldier in the pool of water. I remember reading that in the book and actually having to, it was my joy, put the book in the fridge moment. I had to put the book down because I was like, because it's very graphically described in the book, and actually the scene in the film was what I was kind of waiting for, as it were, because I knew it was coming. And dear God, did that deliver. That was one of the most horrific. It was so again, he's lying there and you can hear all the mud sort of burbling away in his throat, and Paul panics and is like, shit, I didn't actually want to do this, sort of thing. You can see almost this kind of like loss of innocence, but then regaining it really quickly because he realizes. And I guess for me, I'm not saying it changed how I felt about him, but I'm just wondering, did it make you see him differently, or because it is a very brutal thing that he does?
Yeah, in all of the battle scenes, and especially that one, there's a sort of gloss comes over him because he's not really thinking about what he's doing. It's mechanical almost. But in that particular scene, you can see that he's really struggling with it. And obviously things like that have happened elsewhere within the film. He's been involved in sort of intimate moments like that. But that one, because it took so long, I think it was, because it where there were quick kills, but this went on and on and on, and like I say, it was drawn out, and it emphasized just how difficult it can be to kill someone, especially someone who's struggling as much and trying to kill them as well. So yeah, you could see that something that maybe just like the sort of last part of humanity within him kind of disappeared, because you didn't see at any other point after his opponent died, and I don't think it's a big spoiler to say that, he searched him and he found personal items of him as well, just because he definitely felt something. And I think just after that, when it really just kind of disappeared for him, he was just, I think it was just a bit too much for him after that, and it kind of played out that way towards the end, especially like the third act. It was, you could see that it had profoundly changed him.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. There's a big difference between shooting someone at 400 or 500 yards and actually physically putting your hands on someone to kill them. And I think there's a huge change in Paul. I don't think I'd necessarily change how I feel about him, but I think there's a change in Paul from that point onwards, because he's just, I want to say checked out. That's not the word that I mean, but there's something has left him, and he is no longer obviously the young man that he was when he first signed up, as it were. What are your thoughts? So I think I'm right in saying this is Felix Kammerer's sort of debut feature-length performance. What did you think of the performances, particularly, obviously you've got his little group of university friends, and then you have Albrecht Schuh, who's playing Stanislav Kat Kaczynski. What did you think of their kind of dynamic?
I really enjoyed it. It was surprising. I didn't know that this was his first feature role, and to take that character from where he started, which was basically a giggling teenage boy who was in it for, if you think about it at the start, they were talking about this as being an adventure. They were
it's a chance to get medals and travel, and
and that was backed up by the school headmaster giving a big speech. And while they were giving a big speech, the camera was squarely on the boys, and you could just see that they were, this is great, this is going to be great. And the headmaster was saying, it'll be over in 3 months, and you'll be back here with all your tails and like your medals and everything. So there was obviously a naivety about him to begin with. He was just a boy. Even when he was getting his uniform and everything, they were all up for it. And it was the first night, I think it was, when they were in the trenches, where one of his comrades dies horrifically. You almost see a physical change in him. Something just sort of disappears. He becomes a wee bit paler. He becomes a wee bit more drawn. He doesn't look like a boy anymore. He looks like a victim now. And just that gradual change. And then the way it does that, it introduces them all into the trenches and everything, and basically dispels any notion that they have of, one, this is going to only last a wee while, and two, it's going to be an adventure. So as soon as that's established, it cuts to about a year later, and the team are all there, and they're all established at that point, and they're all proper soldiers. And there's that dynamic between Paul and Kat is like an older brother to him in a way. He's like an older brother for all of them, because he's that wee bit older. He's married. he had a career. It was a cobbler or something, I think he said
Yeah,
at one point,
yeah.
you know. So he'd had a bit more life experience, but in a way he relied on the younger guys as well. So that dynamic was really good. It was an older brother, much smarter younger brother dynamic, because like, he couldn't read, for instance. So he kept getting letters from his wife, but he couldn't read. So it was that Paul read to him. So that bond was there between the two of them, especially. So there was a lot of time spent with them as, you know, everything was unfolding within all the action. So yeah, it was very well done, and it was a very mature performance for a first lead. I know we talk about first lead performances and everything, but these guys have obviously been in lots of things before. They don't just pop out acting school, you know, ta-da, hello darlings, I'm ready for my first scene, where's the trench? You know, it's not like that. They're obviously very good actors, because you don't, it's all very well casting a relative unknown in a big budget production, but they have to be able to produce.
You have to carry it. Yeah.
He's carrying the film. Yeah, he's in what, 60% of the film, maybe
Easily.
70%. If you take away the scenes, is it Compagnie, where the armistice was signed in France?
Oh, now you're really testing my first world knowledge. I don't actually know.
Yeah,
I knew it happened on a train. I just didn't know where.
Yes, it was basically two trains came together. One was in France and one came in from Germany, and they met in this place. As I say, I've actually been there. We stopped there on the way back from holiday one year, and it's eerie. It's an eerie place, and it had a replica of the train carriage and everything in it.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
And it's like one of these places that, you know, you feel it in the atmosphere that something happened there, you know, something quite momentous, you know, partly to do with the fact that, you know, you've read about it and everything, but yeah, it's kind of creepy. It's, you know, there's something a wee bit off about it. And then I don't know if you know the history of it, because obviously that was signed there, and during the signing, the head of the French delegation walked out, and that was like an insult to the Germans. And then when the armistice was signed between Germany and France during the Second World War, Hitler did exactly the same thing. And I think he took the original train carriage that was there, they'd left it there as a monument to this armistice. He took it back to Germany to display it in Germany as a war trophy, if you like, as well. So there's a lot of sort of ongoing history with all that as well. And I've completely forgot what the point was as well. I've been going off on that tangent.
You know, I was so busy listening to you, I can't remember what we're talking. We were talking about the dynamic between them all, and obviously like Kat being the sort of elder brother. I did love their relationship. I thought it was sweet that he was kind of saying to Paul, like, you know, don't be an idiot, like go home, finish your education, you know, go and live your life. And there was almost a sort of, not an acceptance from Kat, but this kind of realization that he was sort of talking to him in a, I might not be here type of thing. Like he was, you know, really encouraging him to go back and sort of re-find himself and find his place in society. And obviously, if you do know the history, you'll know the kind of fate that awaited all of those soldiers when they came home, when they were obviously cast out as traitors and, you know, weren't allowed to work and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of, you know, if you've done your reading, there's a lot of kind of stuff going on in your head as you're watching this, and you know what fate awaits these guys. But even if you're not that interested in the history of it, I think there's certainly, you kind of cling to that little dynamic between Kat and Paul, and you're sort of willing them through the film. You're like, just survive this next bit, just get through this next bit, because you want them obviously to come out the other end. I will say for a debut, you know, Felix Camera, I genuinely will never forget the scene after the bunker collapses and he gets up and he's just covered in dust and mud, and literally you can barely see his eyes, like his eyelashes are caked, and he sort of stumbles through and he's, you know, kind of hanging on to the walls and he's looking for his friends. That absolutely took me. He didn't have to speak, didn't have to do anything. It was just, that totally took my breath away, just watching him. And obviously you've got this really brilliant sound design where it feels like your ears are ringing, because there's that kind of sound going off and you're watching him stumble about. It just, it was brilliant. It was so good.
Yep. And then that immediately goes into, like, obviously he sits down there, and he's trying to recover, and then one of the officers comes on and says, "Are you injured?" And he says, "No." And he says, "All right, on you go, start getting the tags off of the dead," you know.
Couldn't believe that. It was like
Get
you
on
could
with
see
it.
the guy was clearly traumatized, and obviously, you know, we didn't have words for that back then, but you could see he was traumatized, and he was like, "Yeah, okay, up you get, go and collect some, you know, tags off the dead." And I was like, "Are you kidding me on? The guy's clearly just, you know, not taking in what's happened." I thought as well, again, you know, there's obviously these kind of moments as well, but I really love the moments where they were sort of sitting doing nothing. So they're obviously kind of shooting the shit, getting some food, getting letters from home. You know, families are promising to send, you know, apples and sausages and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I really love those moments as well, because it was like, it does touch on this in the book as well. He's like, yeah, some months are really boring, and actually we're all just sitting around, and you know, they kind of fancy the local French girls, and they're sort of chancing their arm, trying to chat them up or whatever. And I really enjoyed that as well, because it was light relief from, as I've just said, you know, go and collect some tags off some dead bodies sort of thing. We kind of touched on this earlier. I've watched it a couple of times. I just think, is it a war film? Is it a horror film? I actually can't decide, because to me, horror should make you feel scared. It should make you feel uncomfortable. You know, all these things. It's obviously a little bit gruesome in places as well. I'm like, it's almost like the kind of perfect blend of the two.
Yes. Oh, you're right. Yes, it could definitely be classed as a horror film, because I mean, you hear the phrase all the time, the horrors of war. Well, there you are. It's up on the screen there. It's plain for anybody to see that there was no glory for anybody that was involved in that. Well, anybody that was actually on the battlefield. Obviously, the generals who were sitting behind them obviously had different things to say about it. But yeah, it could very easily be classed as a horror film because of the content, not so much for the graphic violence or anything. The violence was short and sharp, but there was a lot of it, and obviously it was like in scenes where there was people blowing up and getting killed with bayonets and guns and what have you. Yeah, but it was all very quick. That wasn't the emphasis of it, but it all added to the tone of it, which, yeah, you were scared. You were scared for these characters. You were scared for Paul all the way through it. Now, I was obviously particularly scared because I hadn't read the book, hadn't seen the previous film. I didn't know what was going to happen to him, and I think I benefited from that because there was no expectations on my part as far as the main characters were concerned. So, in that respect, it is like a horror film as well. It's like the sort of, you know, who's going to be the last man standing kind of idea. You know, do they get out of this? Do they not get out of it? So that's always playing with you as well. So there's always a constant tension there, which is again classic horror trope. You know, it's this, you have that in pretty much every horror film you see. There's always an underlying tension because it keeps you engaged with the story.
Yeah, I mean, and as you said at the beginning, pretty much from the offset, and obviously I jumped out my skin. I actually jumped out my skin at the moment where he's in, I think it's just after he's killed the French soldier, and he pops his helmet on a stick and just raises it, and of course straight away it's like, and the bullet comes right through it, and I jumped out my skin at that as well, because I was like, if that had been your actual head, he would have been completely dead. It was unbelievable. It was so fast and just came out of nowhere. And I think that's the thing. A lot of the kind of jumpy moments do come out of nowhere because you're so busy focusing on something else that's going on that, you know, something out of left field kind of takes you by surprise. One of the things, I think we talked about this in the last pod we recorded, seemingly they were going to record an English language version, and they had mooted the idea of Travis Fimmel, Star of Vikings, as the cat character, which again, I think would have worked in an English language version. But how important is it that these types of stories are told in their mother tongue, as it were?
Well, I think it's very important because obviously if you're going to have a film predominantly about Germans, then it should be in the German language, because there's a lot that you're having to change in a translation. Plus, you never know what sort of accent you're going to get when someone speaks. I don't mean I don't mean that in a bad way. You know, there's an awful lot of very good actors out there who have played German characters, and when you speak to someone who's German and they speak English, it's not that far away from, you know, the better portrayals of German people speaking English, I think it would have lost something. I think it definitely needed to be in the German language. It's a bold move. It really is, because it can cut down your audience for a start, because you've got this, what do you call it, the 1 inch barrier that people have to go over. Definitely worth it. It really was. And because it was a German production, you didn't know a lot of the characters, obviously, as first time leads and things like that. So you weren't as familiar with them. Again, stakes are higher because you don't really know that, this person's been around for 30 years and been in all sorts of things. So, and he's always a good guy, he's the guy that saves the dog and some romantic comedy film. So you think, he'll survive, but you don't get that because you don't know the characters as well. So yeah, felt it was very important to have it in its like natural language. It meant that you weren't having to try and stop yourself concentrating on a dodgy French accent or a dodgy German accent. It was all just there, and it all just worked because it was all, natural.
When you think about it, though, this is a bit of a... Actually, I mean, first of all, I always think that, some of the most impactful sort of war films that I've seen have been in their mother tongue, and I always think it's really important, if you're going to tell stories, try and tell them the way they want to be told, or the way they ought to be told. And don't get me wrong, I love a big Hollywood war movie like Valkyrie or Schindler's List or something like that. But obviously, how they get around that is just no one does an accent, which I quite like. If we're all bad at it, or even one of us is bad at it, let's none of us do. Let's just keep it in our own. But actually, what you've just said there has just really made me think about how much of a risk this project must have been for Netflix, because it's in German. There are no stars. Daniel Brühl obviously is in it, but barely. So he's probably the biggest draw of all the entire cast. You've got debuts. It's not a popular war on film, if that makes sense. War movies tend to be World War II onwards. The World War I isn't really sort of made for cinema, I don't think. And obviously they've spent an absolute bucket load of money, as I said at the start. It's their most expensive German language production on the platform. You do wonder if the executives at Netflix were a bit worried. And yet it's performed so well, everyone's raving about it, but it must have been a huge risk pitching this as an idea.
Oh, definitely, yes. But Netflix are committed to making content in different languages, primarily for the different markets. So if you're producing German content, it's obviously going to be in the German language. And there's obviously like English language content comes from a number of different sources, but if you look at the content on Netflix, it's from all over the place. They're financing projects on all different countries now, and they're not insisting that they anglicize them in any way. It's some of the times you can get dubbed versions, which I never watched dubbed versions.
This can be dubbed, but I would never watch it.
No,
you can get
it's too distracting. I'm quite happy watching subtitles, and you get far more from the subtitles because it's the original actors that are doing it. So therefore, you're getting all the inflection and all the meaning in their voice, but you don't get that a lot of the time when it's a dubbed version. It's a wee bit flatter. It doesn't emphasize it as much. It can be done by obviously professional voice actors, but it loses something, and the fact that the mouth doesn't sync up to what they're saying.
Yeah.
That's
more really distracting than having to follow subtitles, I think, is watching somebody's mouth not match what they're saying. But obviously, some of their biggest successes have been likes of Lupin, which I absolutely adore, the French series. And they've got loads of, obviously, Scandi noir on there as well, which is sort of perennially popular. Everyone loves a good murder in the forests of Norway. Like, they definitely enjoy that sort of thing. But I do just wonder how much of a risk it was. As I say, it's not a popular war on film. It's not, there's nobody really in the cast that you can properly identify, as being sort of well known, or has made that sort of cross from their own talent pool within their own country, sort of English language films. It just occurred to me, as you said, it must have been a huge risk. Finally, I guess
it's a prestige film rather than just a sort of run of the mill. They've obviously pumped a lot of money into it, and it is the German entry for the Oscar for the.
It sure is
not in an English language. So yes, so there's. They're getting publicity for that, and it's all driving subscribers, that I don't think it hurts them in any way. It may be a bit, they use that as a bit of a loss leader.
Yeah. And to be honest, I would like to see Felix Kammerer nominated for Best Actor.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a completely valid entry. We've obviously shown by the likes of Parasite that films not in the English language can do really well in traditional categories at the Oscars. So I would like to see this up for several awards. I definitely think it's going to be maybe top 5, reach my top 5 of the year, definitely, if not top 10. It's so well done.
Oh, it's definitely going to be my top 5, yeah.
Yeah. I think finally, I guess the question for me is, and I often wonder with war films sort of why they're made, because how many times can you tell the same story over and over again? How relevant do you think the messaging in this film is now?
I think it's probably more relevant now than it has been for a number of years, based on the shit show that is the Western world at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a timely reminder of what happens to ordinary people when conflicts get to such a state that nobody's going to back down, and they're not going to back down for years. If you can imagine this in a bigger scale, it's horrific to think about it, the number of people who would be affected by it. So yeah, I think it's particularly timely at the moment, given the kind of, like we were talking about it earlier, there's rockets falling into Poland and things like that. So yes, it's scarily prescient at the moment.
Which is, I just think it's interesting timing as well. I mean, it's one of the first books I think that the Nazis actually banned, because obviously it's an anti-war novel, and therefore they didn't want people to read it and get an idea that war might not be such a good time.
Yeah.
So I just think it's really interesting that the timing of it is, it's obviously horrific. It's obviously very clear in its anti-war messaging and the sort of futility of war, and how these men in shiny coats and boots make decisions for these poor boys in the front. It's interesting that it's finding an audience at this time where things are a bit on edge at the moment.
Oh, definitely.
Here we go. Anything else you'd like to add on it?
Just about, obviously we touched on the sound design, but the color palette as well that was used throughout the film. To begin with, it was like sort of pale blues and greys pretty much all the way through, apart from the section where you're seeing the boys in school forging their signatures so they can sign up. That's more sort of greeny and browny and stuff, because it's all sort of school based and it's all wooden buildings and things like that. But then it just switches back to this, like say, grey, pale blue for the rest of the film, and it's really, really effective. It just gives this cold sheen to the whole proceedings, and it's very subtly done. It's like a lot of elements in the film, like the sound design, it adds to the film without shouting about the fact that it's doing this. It just merges it in, and it sits there in the background and allows the action and the characters and the story to sort of push forward as well. Another thing that I noticed was there were long periods in this film where there was pretty much no dialogue. I'm considering watching it with the sound down the next time I watch it, because I think you could watch this as a silent film. You could.
Well, see, I was wondering, could you watch it with the subtitles off, and would you still, because there is long periods of silence, and I wonder, would you be able to watch it and follow it? And obviously, I don't speak any German whatsoever, but I think it would still be effective.
I think you could, because it's so much visual storytelling in it. You would get, without, I mean, I'm the same as you. I know a couple of words of German, so I wouldn't be able to really follow conversations. But a lot of the time, you don't need to. You just know that these guys are in hell, and it's not going to change anytime soon. You get so much from expressions. Like, language is only, what is it, 20% or something of conversation, they say. So watching with the sound off, or as you say, with the subtitles off, it would be easily done. I think it would be quite an interesting thing if somebody actually did a version of it just with the cards, the intersectional cards, like a silent film, because I think it would work quite nicely as well in that sort of respect.
Oh, absolutely. I think it would work. I think there's so much of it where it's a look, or it's a a movement of characters and literally moving from point A to point B, or it's, you know, a sense of despair. I think it's very atmospheric. It's what you feel when you're watching it as much as what's physically happening in front of you and what's being said. But you're right. I think that would be a good experiment, actually, either subbies off or sound down. I think it would still be just as effective.
I think you're probably right, rather than the sound down, because then you don't get the sound design. You don't get the atmosphere of it.
The scary horn blasts. Yeah. I honestly, I can't even begin to tell. Like, my ass left the seat. Like, I actually jumped. Like, I was so not expecting that. And I think it's a nice contrast, actually, because I said I was expecting your kind of traditional strings and stuff like that, but to go with quite a bold modern sound, again, it sort of brings back how relevant the messaging is, doesn't it? You know, it's a very contemporary sounding piece of music, which I have tried to listen to a few times on Spotify, but every time it does blast out, I'm like, nope, have to take the headphones out again. So, yeah, I think
you get anything else?
No, that's all good for me. I was just going to ask if you would obviously recommend it for.
Oh yeah, highly recommend this film. I'm only sorry, like you, that I didn't get to see it in the cinema. I don't even know if it was in UK cinemas. I think it had a run somewhere, but not anywhere near us. And I would really like to have seen it on the big screen. Maybe if it gets a bit of an Oscar push, it might. It
might. I was just thinking that because sometimes the GFT do a wee run before Oscar season. I want to hear that sound in it, you know, through a proper speaker system. I want to hear that as opposed to my wee sound bar in the telly. So, and obviously I would recommend it. I mean, quite possibly it's one of the, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think this is one of the best war films I've seen in a long time. And it's definitely going to be top 5, maybe top 3 material for me. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And please, if you are going to watch it, please watch it in the German language version. Please don't watch the English dub. It will just be terrible. It'll take away everything from it.
Yeah.
So that is our latest Moviescramble podcast. We would like to give a wee shout out to Gary Hewitt, who has just launched his short film, Dig, which he is crowdfunding for. And we've done a wee review on the Moviescramble site if you want to go and give that a read. It's an excellent short film that he is trying to get into the festival circuit, and it's good to see Scottish filmmakers getting their stuff out there. So we shout out for Gary and the team there. If you have any ideas for films that you'd like to see us cover in the podcast, you can give us a shout on all the usual social channels at Moviescramble, and you can give us an email because John is frantically checking that inbox and it's still a big fat zero. It is podcast@moviescramble.co.uk, and we will see you on the next pod.
Yep, from this big fat zero as well. Bye-bye.